But while the world is getting more unpredictable, right, there are more geopolitical threats out there. You have climate change. You have perhaps the end of the post-World War II international order. You have in countries that for decades have been considered incredibly stable and predictable, you are seeing much more uncertainty, polarization, unrest, right? So those are all categories at which you would think, boy, this will be a golden age for Intel analysts. Like, we are never going to have enough. And yet, I don't think that is guaranteed to be true.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Collators. Today, we have a very special guest for you. We have a gentleman by the name of Dean Baratta, who is a former intelligence analyst, officer, manager. His career spans law enforcement, the military, academia, the private sector. We're incredibly lucky to have him on the pod with us today because he's just an absolute goldmine of information when it comes to all things intelligence analysis. So welcome to the pod, Dean.
Thank you very much, Mark and Howard. Great to be here. And boy, I hope I can live up to that introduction.
Dean, can you just start us off on your journey then into the long and winding road of intel analysis for you? You can start wherever you like and just maybe give our listeners an idea of your background, where you came from and where you ended up.
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey, East Coast of the United States. And this is going to sound weird. I wanted to be an intelligence analyst before I knew there was a job called intelligence analyst. I was that kid in school who, when the teacher assigned research projects, I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. And I can remember being 14, 15 years old, working on some sort of school project, just going, man, I wish there was a job where I could do this sort of thing and get paid for it. This would be amazing. And I was a big history buff, and I would read, whether it was about the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or the World War II, and I'd read about not necessarily the kings and generals making the decisions, but the people behind the scenes who were informing them, who were helping them make decisions. And I was like, that sounds phenomenal. Like, I wish I could do that. But sort of resigned myself to that being something that only happened in the olden days, never be an opportunity to do that. And as I was getting towards the end of my high school years, I was set to go to university, but I didn't really feel like I wanted to do that. Didn't really feel like I was ready to do that. So I started talking to some military recruiters, and in the U.S. Army, they had this big book of potential jobs, and I was flipping through it, and nothing really resonated with me. And I came to intelligence analyst and read the little 2 paragraphs about what that was and just fell in love. And I was like, this is what I have to do. So graduated high school, went right into the Army, became an intelligence analyst at 18, did that for a few years, got out and got a university degree. And again, was hoping to be able to stay in the field, but...
So you were an analyst in the Army, is that right?
I was, yeah. So I was stationed back in West Germany with the 1st Brigade, 8th Infantry Division, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, when there was a West Germany, and great experience.
What kind of training did you get for that? Did you get any training for that?
So yes, they sent us to, at that point, and I think still, their training for intel analysts is at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and it was 14 weeks of training. And basically all that allows you to do is it sort of sets you up to be an apprentice intel analyst. Like you're qualified to sit in the room while real analysts are doing the work, right? Or at least that's the way it was in 1987. And oddly enough, all my reading of history and playing war games and all that really helped me in that intel analysis training. I was like, oh, I know what the symbols mean and I understand the strategies. And, that was really helpful.
And was that your first notion of what intelligence analysis was as a concept?
Yes, was in the military, and it was looking at the 8th Guards Army in East Germany and what motorized rifle regiments and motorized rifle divisions might come across the border, and thinking about T-80s versus T-64 tanks and that sort of thing, right? So it was very much, it was conventional military focus for those first couple of years. Got out, went to university. I briefly had dreams of getting into one of the 3-letter agencies, but at that time, 1992-ish. The Cold War was wrapped up and agencies were looking for something very specific that I didn't have. So I realized my glory days were probably over. I was going to have to get a more conventional career. I went into banking, retail banking for a few years, and it was okay, but I wasn't really satisfied. So I decided to go back in the military reserves. And I was like, hey, this will scratch my itch. I'll still be an analyst, but I'll do this part-time. And from there, a series of incredibly fortuitous events happened. A position opened up through the National Guard that I was a member of for a full-time slot in what was called the National Guard Counter-Drug Program. And that paired people in the National Guard who had specific skills with law enforcement agencies to help in narcotics investigations. So that could be helicopter pilots who could assist. And one of the categories some agencies needed was intelligence analysts. So I worked for a state law enforcement agency, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, and began to learn about narcotics investigations and street gangs and things like that. There, I got no training. And I remember talking to my boss saying, gee, I've only dealt with thinking about the Soviet Union or North Korea or Russia. Like, what am I doing now with cocaine and crack and ecstasy on the streets? And how do I think about it? And the words of advice I was given is, oh, it's the exact same thing. Don't worry about it. It was not the exact same thing. It was totally different, right? Having to think about, and you guys will know this, things like probable cause and rules of evidence and, things like that, which were just not a concern when
I'm guessing in your military background, you were more strategic, right? It was more like troop numbers, tank movements, long-term, long view, where this is more kind of operational, tactical, individuals and groups.
Right.
Clandestine
exactly,
type
right.
stuff.
You're worried about, even on a tactical level, you're worried about what avenue of approach this battalion or this company is going to take to get from, this place to that place, not how is this person smuggling drugs from New York City to Philadelphia and how are they, what's their background and how are they likely to get leveraged and that sort of thing. So it was both very exciting. It was a huge, very steep learning curve, but it was great because it was the first time I think I was actually able to see concrete results of my work, right? The first time you turn on the local news and there's a story about a large arrest and drugs taken off the street and you're like, oh, I did part of that. That was a nice little rush. So I did that for a few years and then was hired by the New Jersey State Police right across the border. They had a street gang unit and New Jersey at the time had a pretty significant street gang problem and so had its own dedicated unit. And I was one of 2 or 3 intelligence analysts who were dedicated just to work that issue. And that I did that for roughly 9 years. I think it was. In between there, I forgot to mention, was very important. I did a tour in Afghanistan. I was activated and did a tour of Afghanistan. That was fascinating because even though I was trained by the military, probably the most value I got in understanding the security situation in Afghanistan was my law enforcement background. Insurgencies looked a lot more like street gangs than they did the 27th Guards Motorized Rifle Division, right? So my law enforcement experience at that point was super helpful in understanding what was going on in Afghanistan. And I found myself when I was stationed there with a lot of reservists who were on the civilian side were law enforcement officers. So all of a sudden we had 2 shared languages, right? We both spoke and knew the military word and we spoke and knew the law enforcement world. It became much easier for those of us who came from wildly different parts of the country to immediately begin to bond and begin working together and thinking about the environment we were in. So came home, was in the street gang unit for about 9 years, and then transferred to the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, where I started as an analyst. And after a couple of years, they had a big reorganization, and I ended up running their analytics section. About a dozen analysts who were focusing on all sorts of terrorist threats that could affect the citizens and operations of the state of New Jersey. January of 2018, there was a new political administration that got voted in, and I was the victim of new personnel changes, wanting to go in a new direction, right? Whatever the catchphrase is. So I found myself in the private sector and worked for the next 8 years until until just about last summer. First for a company called WeWork, which was very interesting. We can talk about that huge culture shift from government service, and then moved to a company called GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft. And that was a mid-sized tech company, about 4,000 people. Absolutely fascinating, great place to work, and great place to sort of end my career. But I started there in January of 2020, and 3 weeks later, COVID hit. And all of a sudden, I found myself not worrying about Soviet military or insurgents or terrorism or drug dealers. I became the unofficial chief pandemic officer, and all of a sudden had to learn about epidemiology and public health and help the executives there make decisions about that. And then last summer, I decided to pull the plug and sort of went into semi-retirement. And just a few months ago, I began working with one of my former analysts who formed her own company called GAD Intel, where we do training, sort of custom training and consultation with private sector folks who are looking to up their game, their analytic game.
It's an incredible journey. I want to go back a little bit. I'd like to go back to when you essentially left the public sector and landed in private sector land. Am I right in assuming that was perhaps the biggest culture shock or the biggest shift from what you've experienced? Okay.
Yeah.
Could you describe what that's like?
Yeah, for a couple of reasons. So I would say my whole career, if you asked me in December of 2017 to define myself, public servant would be very high up on that list of how I identified myself. Husband, son, public servant, Intel analyst, something like that. And so the transition was sudden and pretty unexpected. It really kind of came out of the blue. So all of a sudden, I know one of those core tenets of my identity was gone. And that took some getting used to. There was, no other way to put it. There was sort of a mourning period there where I had to sort of figure out who am I now that I am no longer a public servant. And then moving to the private sector, at the time, WeWork was, I can't say if it still is, but it was a very, I don't know how to describe it, very loosey-goosey compared to the public sector in terms of its focus on sort of security. It's just not what that organization was, right? So I went from spending a couple decades where security and intelligence was the center, the central mission, the essential mission, to being pretty far out on the fringes of importance to this organization. So going through this mourning period, also going through my work is just not as central to the mission of this organization. What does that mean? How do I fit in here? How do I fit into this culture with an organization where almost nobody is familiar with security, with intelligence? How do I introduce some of these concepts that may be basic to you or me, but are brand new to other people? How do I do that in ways that will enhance the security of the organization, not infringe on the culture of the organization, and not freak people out, essentially, right? Because I'm sure you all know when you talk to audiences who may not have the same background you do, it's easy for people to get scared, to get panicked, right? You're talking about criminals or terrorists or whatever, all sorts of threats and risks. And people might get, oh my God, I'm afraid to leave my house now, right? Like, I have to live in a bubble. So how do you navigate all that at the same time? And I would say it took me a good 4 to 6 months to sort of feel comfortable in my skin and get a new bearing on sort of how to go forward.
You described WeWork and that kind of corporate, explain there's this culture difference of you don't want to freak people out. And we've spoken to a few people on the pod this season from the private sector who there is this emerging pattern of, I think that's one response to what we call, for sake of argument, call them intel types. But there's another response that's almost kind of like what do you do? Who the hell are you? The real world works like this. Do you have any challenge? Was it challenging trying to, because you've got to bring the whole Intel analysis and Intel framework with you, right? I guess, were you left alone? Was that something that was just something you had to do within your local team? Or did you have to kind of bridge any kind of cultural gaps to kind of get that across? And I'm thinking more in mind of your senior managers, maybe, because I think you alluded to it that almost it was, I'm not being critical here, but you said that you weren't as central to the organization as you perhaps were. And I think we see that with a lot of corporates is the large corporates is they do have an Intel arm, but it's almost like an extra appendage. It's not central to core operations, right?
Yeah, it could be something that you're required to have, right? Or you're seen to be required to have. And so we got to check the box and have it. And this just really boils down to individual leadership. I would say at at WeWork, there was such a culture of optimism and enthusiasm that I think the idea that there might be people out there who might wish you harm or just may not be good actors. Maybe they're not intentionally targeting you, but just there might be bad things happening where we happen to be, just seemed an odd concept to a lot of people in the organization.
Were you the only pessimist in the room by any chance?
Boy, I don't even like to say pessimist really, because I just see it as realist, right? And it's something you navigate. Sometimes you do need to tell people, hey, this is more dangerous than you think it is. It's more risky than it is. But by the same token, I am just as frequently talking to senior execs who see something on the news and be like, oh my God, should I go to Los Angeles? I just heard there was like this horrible crime there. And you're like, that's a city of like 10 million people. You are not going to any of these like dangerous areas. You're going right to a meeting. You're going to be fine, right? Like here's some tips to make sure you don't do something bad. But other than that, you're fine. So there's just as much, I like to say analysts spend just as much time spinning people down as they do spinning people up. And it's knowing when to do those. But, WeWork, just this huge, like I said, huge culture of sort of optimism and enthusiasm and focused on building the business. And that was the lodestar that they kept going towards. And so it was a little harder to say, hey, maybe we don't want to create an office in this particular country because the security situation is very unstable versus, oh my God, we get to build an office in this country. Nobody else is there. Let's think about how cool that would be and trying to sort of temper that. So that's one. I will say, this is why it's very leadership dependent. When I went to GitHub, absolutely amazing leadership team there that did not have a lot of security experience, but knew they needed some security expertise, right? And so we're very open and very smart about the questions they asked. And some of this, I might be getting a little far afield from where you asked, but some of this revolves around the Intel professional asking questions to determine what is your risk tolerance? How can I find a solution that mitigates risk that doesn't cause you to panic, cause you to say, this security thing, it's just going to cost me a ton of money, destroy the company, and get us somewhere we don't want to go. How do we navigate that? And I think that's one of the big differences from public sector to private sector is I found myself much more making recommendations than I did in public sector, where at least in America, there's very much sort of a taboo between the analysts and the operational folks. You don't make recommendations. It might taint you. You might bring in biases that you don't want to do. Analysis needs to be seen as objective. Whereas in the private sector, more often than not, I had executives going, I'm paying you. What am I paying you for if you're not telling me how to mitigate this risk or how to get around this, or at least giving me options to pick from? And that, and it was the two organizations were just very different in terms of their approach and embrace of intelligence security.
That's fascinating what you say about in your US Intel analysis experience, you're saying that the focus was on essentially describing what the situation was as opposed to here's a situation plus recommendations. You're saying that was something to be avoided to a certain extent, but the private sector difference is recommendations was part of the show. Is that fair?
That was my experience. Now, I've talked to colleagues who, that sort of prohibition of offering recommendations really sort of trickles down from the federal intelligence community, where you just don't get into that. A lot of that trickles down at the state and local level in public service. I think it's generally less relevant, but it's just a tradition that carries through. I've talked to some folks who are in private sector who say, no, we still do not make recommendations. Absolutely not. And I think that's a bit of that sort of cultural tradition that they haven't shaken loose yet. Some of those folks are super successful, so I'm not going to say it's the wrong way. But again, personally, I have found senior executives very much like to hear that. They like to hear options. They like to hear what the pros and cons are. They're going to have more insight. They have a broader view of the company. So they may say, Dean, your recommendation 1 and 2 just aren't going to fly because of these particular characteristics of our organization. Okay, I can go back and retool, talk to some other elements within the company, try to come up with other options. But, I find that they're very hungry for that sort of discussion and that sort of feedback.
Can I ask you then, obviously you brought with you to the private sector a lot of skills and experience from intelligence land. Can I ask you, what do you think is the biggest thing you learnt from the private sector that maybe would have helped you a bit earlier in your intel career?
It would be thinking about recommendations. Absolutely. That's probably the biggest, is thinking in those terms. I did spend some time when I first went into private sector trying to maintain that same tradition. They would ask questions. Well, gee, you've just said this, you've identified this big security flaw, this vulnerability or this risk. What do we do about it? Oh, no. I don't do that. You need to talk to these other people, or you need to make your own decision. That's not my job. We don't do that. And it just felt like it created this unnatural barrier and sort of forced myself into irrelevance. It just didn't fit right. So that was number one. I would say number two is learning to change the language that we use. So coming from military law enforcement, boy, it's super easy to throw around a lot of acronyms, talk about a lot of war stories. Oh, well, you have this problem with one of your offices in Cincinnati. Well, let me tell you how we did it when we were outside the wire in Bagram, right? And no, it just doesn't work. And I understand the desire to do that, right? You've built a lot of expertise. You want to sort of demonstrate it, number one. Number two, it can be a shortcut in an attempt to sort of establish credibility, right? Like, I've been in this shit, like, I know my stuff. But I find that creates more barriers than it helps. I'd much rather talk to folks in language that they're comfortable using, that they use every day, as if we're out having a cup of coffee, right? That makes them, my experience, makes it more likely that they're going to ask questions, they're going to engage in a discussion, and I want them to walk away with information that they could relay to others in a way that's going to make sense, as opposed to them going, I don't know, this guy who works for me told me about something happening in Afghanistan, and so that's why we have to implement this procedure here. I'm not sure I really get it, right? Like, you don't want them confused. So if we can meet them on their ground, use language that makes it easier for them to absorb and consume, that for me is sort of the big lesson.
I recognize a lot of what you're saying, Dean, and just a couple of thoughts come into my head. The first is, I think a good analyst, you could have all the training and expertise and professional development in the world, but one of the key skill sets that you have to have is the ability to be flexible and change not only your point of view and your function, but how you deliver and interact with your clients and your customers in this new world. Because ultimately the object is to add value to whatever function you're servicing. And you can do that in many ways. The second thing is, you talked about leadership and speaking to leadership. And here I totally agree on that. I've spent a lot of my career as a manager, both in law enforcement and academia, learning about management and organizational philosophies. And I'm a big believer in something that they call transformational leadership. It's just a phrase. But basically, you're going in and you've got to try and persuade the whole team to go with you and engage with you, so you transform everything. And you can be that kind of leader. This is an important thing for analysts. You can be that kind of leader regardless of your rank or your role in an organization. It reminds me of the apocryphal tale of the guy sweeping up at NASA, and the president walks in and says, "What do you do around here?" And he says, "Well, I'm part of the team that put a man on the moon." That creating a round table of culture where we've all got different functions and we wear different hats, but we're all part of the same team. The other thing that stands out is when you migrate into that new environment, and it might just be a new data set, you might not have left your organization, or a new issue like you mentioned, COVID. I love doing that because when I'm out of my comfort zone, I have to think creatively. I have to find new data sources and maybe new ways of interacting, all of what you're talking about, because you can be as confident in your work and the process as you wish, but a bit like an educator. If you're not entertaining, if they're not listening to you, you're not really educating. Well, if you're producing these products and saying, I'm the analyst and therefore I am, if it's not the right food for the organization or delivered in the right way, it's not going to propel the function. And I love this idea of walk softly and carry a big stick. Go in and have a look. And it's not just about how the organization works, but the culture. How many times do you read a mission statement and values for an organization or its key performance indicators? Then you look at the real organization and think, They're just paper exercises. The reality of how this organisation works couldn't be more different. So if you're focusing on those, you're wasting your time. Then you have to gently find a way of how to interact with these people. Some people are very reluctant to be seen to make mistakes or take risks. Certainly in law enforcement, and I found that with quasi-government organisations, there's a real fear amongst leaders about the consequences of risk. And I don't mean just mean losing life or not protecting society, the obvious things, but the personal risk to their organisational reputation or rank. You know, I've got the jam sandwich of badges on the shoulder, so I'm more important than the next guy. No, you're not. You have a more important function and a greater power base, but you still have the same role. And to be able to get those people to talk to you in a comfort zone, kind of a comfortable way, like you say, over a cup of coffee, where you can be quiet, you can listen to them and learn about them. Mark and I often talk about part of the process of being effective intelligence analysts is learning how to present your products, when, where, how and why, to the decision makers if that's your role. Because if you don't follow those rules and get them right, you will be dismissed. And regardless of the impact on you, you're not an effective contribution to the organisation then. You can be a problem. And often what we're raising can be really problematic to the organisation, because I used to get called the troublesome priest. They loved what I did, but sometimes what I was raising as a management or organisational team player behind the scenes was problematic or inconvenient. My job is to present this to you. I don't have the hard job of making the decision. You're the guy or gal who was going to put your neck on the line and make the decisions. That's what the big bucks are for. But I will tell you, here's a number of options. If you want to challenge me on any of them, like you say, please do. You're welcome to look at my working out. Everybody can analyse. You know, we're all born with analytic skill. It's not my sole domain. You know, second guess me. But if you can't second guess me and find a reason why what I've done is wrong, then maybe it's an important thing, even if you've not considered it before. And that suddenly brings these things out from left field, new points of view. But it's all about engaging with that culture. And you're actually taking people with you in a non-confrontational way, or a very confrontation with a small c.
It's interesting. I remember talking with a lot of my my early career analysts, and they would put together great products. They'd submit them. And even if we weren't making recommendations, they would have in their minds, gee, this will probably drive this decision or whatever. And when that didn't happen, when leadership went in a different way, sometimes they'd be upset. And I'd say, look, as analysts, what we can, the best we can expect, not the best, but a good outcome is if you submit your analysis and the senior leader or the leader, decision maker, gave the time to absorb it, to consider it, even if they made a different decision, that's, like you said, that's their responsibility. That's what they get paid for. As analysts, we really just want to make sure that our product is that they've incorporated that into their decision-making process, right?
Absolutely.
It may not go the way we want. That's the rules of the game, right? They are not always they aren't beholden to us. They aren't going to make our decision every time. That's okay. Some, you win some, you lose some. But if we can walk away and go, hey, they took our product seriously, they incorporated it, they used it for their decision-making process, that's a win for us.
That's very much the thing. It's about respecting the process and the product that we went through, not necessarily doing what we thought might be the optimal solution. And over time, Mark and I have discussed this a lot, you end up where those senior managers eventually learn to respect your thought process. I've had regularly senior managers, once they got to know me and my thought process, you'd sit in a meeting and say nothing. And they'd actually see you say nothing. So you're being respectful. You think about the military. And somebody would look across it and say, Howard, you're not saying anything. Yes, sir. Go on, what are you thinking? And you'd say, well, and they'd open the door to you contributing. And they wouldn't always go that way, but suddenly you're an effective part of the team. And it's not about rank or role. It's about what you're bringing to the table and that respect. And sometimes I get this with analytic students and colleagues. Sometimes we cannot find a reason why we come up with a product, or we look at some data and think, the way this has been presented, it doesn't pass the smell test. For some reason, it just doesn't sit right with me. The hairs are on the back of my neck. Do I know why? No. And my start point there is, right, let's go back at how the data was collected. Is it the right data? Are we missing something? Has it been analysed in the right way? Is a different perspective we can look at? What are the factors involved? Why am I, is it me? Is it something in me? A self-reflection and analytic of my own process. Is there something new here I'm missing? Or is it actually I'm seeing something, I just don't know what the methodology is that I need to be able to corroborate and correlate it and give it some strength and depth to say, not only does this not seem right, but this is why I think it seems wrong. Because we're all working in this sea of the great unknown. The one thing that always annoys me is everybody thinks even you watch TV programs on law enforcement or the military where there's an intel component. The technology is always super wow, and the analysts are always smart and good looking and, camera friendly, or they're really freaky and different. They always get to cherry pick the right data, or it comes in just at the right time in the process, because it's part of the story, because you can't end up with failure or success. And the real life is, there's so much data out there. I used to say, as an SIO senior investigator looking at homicide, right, I've been given a homicide to investigate. I know I didn't do it, so the suspect pool is the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And then I'll start, and it sounds daft, but it's the same with data. What information should we collect that's relevant to our task? Well, even the data pools that are being created and the technology are changing so quickly that today's hot data source, new data source, is tomorrow's old newspapers. And that, for me, is about, it's a sexy part of being an intel analyst and self-development, personal development. How can we maintain in this changing world a relevant and valuable perspective where we've got, even if we don't know what the answer is, we know that we actually don't know. It's the old Donald Rumsfeld,
That's a neat segue for where I want to take us, really. I do want to pass quite on something you just said, Howard, which is I do love, and I think Dean Pull has similar views, which is you see on TV or movies, the analyst firing at the keyboard. They need blueprints to this building in Eastern Europe, and they need it now. And when I spoke to other people who are not from our line of work, they say, is that what you do? It's like, no, that's not what I do. The closest I can get is dots on maps, maybe. But
then we get false blueprints. Or
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's never wrong or the wrong building. Or,
negative information.
But we said off air, we were going to try and take it a little bid deeper for intel analysis. So I think, let's try and go there then. Because the heart of what I want to try and get at, Dean, if you don't mind me asking, because we did talk about this off air a little bit. I'd like to kind of push you on what you think about intelligence analysis as a discipline. As in, I would say we've broadly had two schools of thought, very broadly on this pod. Camp one, intelligence analysis is a definitive, distinct discipline. It's unique. It's a set of skills, not taken reference, whatever. But it's a very specific way of dealing with information that can yield results almost in any environment. And people are quite passionate about that. School of Thought 2 says intelligence analysis is a toolkit. And inside that toolkit, there are things like critical thinking, logic, Socratic questioning, other bits and pieces. And when you go outside the intelligence community into anywhere else, you've been to private sector land, but people gone to third sector or public sector, non-law enforcement, because that's where I've gone. I've tried to make this stuff work in either in healthcare or in the private sector. Do you have a view? Do you have a third view? Is something? How do you view it as a specific discipline, something separate from everything else, or how would you kind of define it or describe it to people?
So I think my heart would like to see it as its own discipline and profession, but my head sees it very much as more of a toolkit, right? So I love this field. Like I said, this is what I wanted to do before I knew it was a job. And I have never been more enthusiastic about a job I've had other than this one. This is when I teach and I'm working with students who have almost limitless possibilities of the field they can go into. And I see that super sharp student who loves digging into research, connecting the dots, finding meaning. Boy, by the end of the semester, I am pitching them and I'm like, are you sure you want to go into this field where you can make $400,000 a year? Wouldn't you rather be an intel analyst where you'll make, a fraction of that, but do this really cool stuff? So I would love to be able to point to it, but it is, in my mind, it's not a profession. It's not like medicine. It's not law. It's not architecture, right? It is not its own distinct thing. But it does have characteristics that are, I don't know if unique might be too strong of a word, but are distinctive. And I do think that is more than just sending somebody to, a class to learn how to quote unquote think critically, right? There's more to it than that, but it's not medical school. I tend not to get more granular than that because I feel like the more I try to pin it down, the harder it is to get a handle on. There's a researcher in the States, Maria Robson Morrow. She writes quite a bit about, is intelligence a profession? Is it not? And I think she describes it now as much more like a guild structure. And I think you guys had a talk about this not that long ago. And I think she's been arguing, I don't want to speak for her, so if I get this wrong, it's my fault. I think she's been arguing, hey, we want to get more standardized. We want to become more of a profession. I really like the guild structure because it's worked for me, where the learning is you learn to be an analyst through work like a guild system where you are a journeyman and you are working under a master analyst. Unfortunately, that means for a whole bunch of analysts who work under poor analysts, you are going to get very, a mixed bag in terms of who you're getting, right? You can't be guaranteed of any sort of or much shared knowledge and methodologies and working. So that is difficult. I've been very fortunate for most of my career in having those opportunities to learn under really good masters and hopefully being able to pass on that to those who've come after me. But what does that mean for the future? I have no idea. And I love doing that mentoring and guild master role. And I hate to make myself obsolete by saying, yes, let's have a formal training program that anyone can do. And you can go to a med school and get blessed off, and I can ride off into the sunset. So all of that is to say, I'm not sure it's possible to nail it down definitively. B, I have a lot of personal biases in the answer to that question. So I probably am giving you a tainted result. Yeah. So
I think that I really appreciate both a thoughtful and a really in-depth answer. I think, and that wasn't meant to try and draw you out or to make you feel uncomfortable. It was you've probably heard on other pods me and how debate this. I agree. I'm with you 100%. I think there is something special in the intelligence role, in the role of analysts and intelligence officers. I find it very hard to define. I find it very hard to describe. And if I'm having a conversation with a budget holder of a private sector organization, I'm going to fail, to be frank. I do wonder, though, if this is part of, and we might get to AI if there's time, I wonder, though, if there was a world where we didn't have the analyst, but we had better analysis through our operational arms and our technology. And maybe we didn't have this discrete role where, and there's a benefit to a discrete role, and we'll get that, and I'll let you come in a second. But I think one of those unique things that you and I are kind of alluding to, but struggling to describe, I think the analyst is set apart from the core organization. But you've given blessing to be the naysayer, to be the devil's advocate. You've almost been imbued with this to be a paid for outsider. And I think that works very well in a various public sector contexts because, you get in an investigations context of police, a set of eyes who's outside the rank and structure, who's free to say what they want, that has value. I guess you'd probably tell me different, but I imagine it's the same in the military. Having someone in the intel analysis space who can say, okay, Senior Officer X, I know you think this, but actually all the data points to that. And then having that, because you're the intel, you've probably got more scope to contradict that senior officer than perhaps one of his direct subordinates. So I think having somebody in an official office of opposition, if that makes sense, and I don't mean a red team, blue team, I just mean just as a critical friend, I think that's part of the secret sauce, maybe. But how that translates into the future and how we get that across organizational boundaries, I'm not sure. So
there's two bits of information at bookends of my career that I'll talk about that fit in there, and maybe they'll spark some ideas. So when I said I wanted to do this before I knew there was a job, one of the reasons that started that is I was reading history about, you may have heard of him, 15th century, 16th century Italian diplomat, philosopher, Niccolo Machiavelli. As a 16-year-old, I was reading his works. I was, really interested and excited. You can tell. I didn't get invited to a lot of parties, you can tell. One of the things I found fascinating is he was I don't want to say a mid-level, not at the top level of echelons in the Florentine government. He would be sent on diplomatic missions. The Florentine government would say, hey, we need some advice on like how to defend ourselves. Is a militia better or mercenaries? And he would get sent on all these sort of different tasks to do the analysis, to advise the government and provide his recommendations. And that's one of the things I was like, wow, that's exciting. He's doing this kind of work one day, then he's going on a different deep dive another day. Like, wow, that's great. And that was one of the things that sort of attracted me to this field generally. And much like you say, this sort of role of being kind of outside of the field where you're asked for expertise, asked to be the devil's advocate, whatever. Throughout my career, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but that's where I most succeeded. Where I was least successful is where here's the 3 books of standard operating procedures. Here's your cubicle. Here's your role. Punch these buttons on these days. Do this. I wasn't as effective there. Tons of analysts, I knew colleagues who were awesome at doing that. That was not me. But then at the end of my career, towards the end of my career, when COVID was going on and there was nobody else in the organization, the senior executive said, Dean, we want you to take the lead on this, sort of tracking what's going on, giving us the assessment for our various offices and our personnel, and then derive recommendations. As that process was going on, our chief operating officer was saying, I think I want to have Dean do something called special projects, which is a nebulous term, might be a career death sentence. But in this case, we are getting questions and problems that our organization doesn't have a line and block chart of how to deal with it. And Dean is demonstrating the ability to sort of handle these miscellaneous problems that come up. I want him to be able to do those. And that, I think, is what you're getting at in a way, Mark. And I find that super exciting. I love the challenge of, here's something you didn't even know existed 24 hours ago. We need to get an answer to it because it's essential to us continuing to be successful. Figure it out and report back to us. Like, wow, that's great.
That's music to my ears. There's just a few things I want to string in to kind of structure this. The idea of the guilds, if you said there's a subject matter knowledge and expertise, which is a combination of knowledge, which you might get through learning, but also knowledge and experience gained through practical application, doing it in the real world and, evaluating your success and or failure. That could be the guild. So it's the body of knowledge and experience. I say that because I want to separate it from human beings. The danger with the guild structure is you automatically, therefore, create bias in that, firstly, however high you've gone up the structure, it could still be a complete failure as an analyst, but if you've done more courses and had more experience, under that pure structure, you should be higher up the hierarchy, and it's not about success or failure. So the knowledge of itself and the experience of itself isn't a guarantee of success. Second thing is, you also get the compartmentalization. I'm a specialist in X, so I'm now important. No, somebody could be a specialist in Y, a different perspective, and I had it back in the day between IALIA, the International Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Analysts, and IACA, the International Association of Crime Analysts. Phrases that they created, and there were 2 organizations. And I would sit down and I happened to be an IALIA. I was a member of IACA as well. I joined all sorts of things because I'm on the quest for new knowledge. I'll take it from anywhere. And I remember sitting there down saying, well, what's the difference? You're both working in law enforcement. Oh, we analyse crime data. Well, crime reports of themselves don't tell you about do you not do studies of the demographics and the social networks in those areas? Do you not study intelligence information before you come up with products? Oh, yeah. But we start with crime data. Well, what if people don't report crimes? Does that mean you starve for information? And then you go to the intel people. Right, you're doing intel product. Oh, yes, we do intel. Right, do you never look at crime reports? Of course we do. You see what I'm saying? But they start building professional bodies and we're big fish in a small bowl. They're irrelevant. And it's the same with academia or training courses. My training course is the best because I wrote it. Everybody would say that because there's no point writing training if customers don't come, whether or not you charge for it. There's some performance measure, and why come to me or us instead of somebody else? It creates a conflict and a competition. So keeping the guild knowledge as this kind of shibboleth, this structure that we all pick from or go up and down, but we don't control it, is maybe a good thing. But then the second thing is, Every human being is an analyst. And for me, some people are better at it naturally than others. Some people can be trained or through training and experience become better. Just because you happen to be a senior exec in the private sector or law enforcement or the military, it doesn't mean you're not analysing information and collecting data. It's what we do from anthropologically. So you can't say only analysts should do it. My answer is it's an open field, but it's a bit of a, what they call it, when it comes to a point. So you've got high volume at the bottom and everybody's doing it at a certain low level. But as you go up, if you apply the skills and knowledge from the guild information, you will be able to do it better. Not a guarantee, but in broad terms, anybody. So you could take managers and say, if you want to dip into some of these skill sets, and I've done it with managers, I'm not going to train you to be analysts, but I'm going to train you to understand some of the information handling and decision-making factors that might help you understand your role better and how to use these tools better.
Yeah, give you sort of a framework with which to begin to hang your experience on, right?
That's how I've ended up at this stage of my career, reviewing it, viewing it, and that's what I would recommend to other people. And what's good about that is the knowledge can be changing and constant, but the people interacting with it can be changing or constant as well. And the organizational needs can be changing. They're all actually, although they interact, they're not tied, So basically, if there were no Intel analyst specialists, there'd be no Intel analysis. That's just patently nonsensical.
Yep. Agreed.
For me, it's kind of like cooking or driving. I love Formula One and NASCAR and things like that. I love racing. I couldn't drive a car. I could drive a car. I was a police-trained advanced driver. So I have a certain skill level and a lifetime of experience. But I don't have the natural skill or the training and experience of driving at that level to perform in the same way. And I think the Intel analysts who are the best of the best, the kind of consultants, the mentors, should be the ones who've gone up that pyramid and not only gone up the pyramid in terms of what they know and what they've experienced as widely as possible, but they have the right attitude about, we're just journeyman, we're still learning. And this is just our lived experience. It's not the be-all and end-all. There may be somebody who comes after me, and this could be any of us, that has a better idea. Like you said with your students. I've always said in every class I've ever done anywhere in the world, and I've trained people from 50 countries in Intel rather than just law enforcement stuff or management. I learn more from them and every new student than they learn from me, because I'm preaching a vocation, not just a career and the knowledge set and values. I'm impacting with their value judgment, but that's fairly routine. But every new person in that classroom has a different lived experience. They're joining this field, this group of people from a different place. So I have to think about how can I most effectively. They come up with the best ideas. They're the ones who shake me out of my comfort zone. And that's what it's all about.
What do you think is the biggest challenge then for Intel analysis right now? What do you think and sorry, and it's not allowed to be AI unless it really has to be.
All right. So putting aside that, which I do think is the biggest challenge, maybe for a different reason though. So I always have one eye firmly on the next generation, the next cohort coming through. And I think they are facing challenges that are unique compared to the 40 years that I've been doing Intel analysis, right? So while, and I hate using some of these cliches, but while the world is getting more unpredictable, right? There are more geopolitical threats out there. You have climate change. You have perhaps the end of the post-World War II international order. You have in countries that for decades have been considered incredibly stable and predictable, you are seeing much more uncertainty, polarization, unrest, right? So those are all categories at which you would think, boy, this will be a golden age for Intel analysts. Like we are never going to have enough. And yet, I don't think that is guaranteed to be true. In some part, I think a lot of organizations, public or private, are going to be are going to continue to be slow to sort of understand the scope of change that we very well may be facing, preparing the next generation for that change and what it looks like, as opposed to just preparing them for what the threats and risks looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I think the technology, which shall not be named, is going to be a really strong siren song for a lot of organizations to say, we don't need new folks. We can just offshore this to a cheap technological solution, which is going to have downstream effects, because if those people aren't getting the experience that I had when I was 18 as an apprentice analyst, seeing how the sausage is made, learning how to make decisions, being forced at 18, 19 to get in front of a whole bunch of senior officers and figure out how to brief. If they don't get that experience when they're 20, 22, 25, and they have to try to pick it up for the first time when they're 30, 32, 35 or older, they are just going to be behind the ball. It's going to be harder for them to build their knowledge, their subject matter expertise, and the softer skills, the communication skills, the audience analysis skills. And if they don't have that, it doesn't matter how much they know or what answers they get from any particular technology. They're not going to be able to transmit it effectively. They're not going to understand it. They're not going to be able to answer the second and third order questions that come from it. And all of that leaves me a bit pessimistic about the field and where it goes. So
I hope you consider maybe coming back, because I think I would like to get into AI with you a lot more.
I would love to, yeah. And other than that, Mark and Howard, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you guys.
Thank you so much for today, and can't wait to speak to you again.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you, Dean.
This episode of The Collators was hosted by Mark Lockwood and Howard Atkin. If you like the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find more episodes over at thecollators.com. Thank you for listening.